The landlord's assistant slid the lease renewal across the counter and said the rent was going up $210 a month. Polly signed it without arguing. He always signed without arguing. That was the version of him everyone in this building knew. The quiet guy in Unit 4B who paid on time, never complained about the elevator, and nodded politely when the rent went up again. Nobody in that building knew what was sitting in Polly's brokerage account. Nobody knew about the second account either, the one he never mentioned, the one that had crossed 6 figures 11 months ago and kept climbing. To his neighbors, he was just a renter, a tenant, someone who existed underneath the building, paying into it, never above it. That was the part nobody understood. Polly wasn't broke. Polly wasn't struggling. Polly had simply decided, 3 years earlier, that looking rich and being financially free were 2 completely different games, and he was only interested in playing one of them. This is where it actually started. Not with a windfall, not with some secret trading strategy. It started 4 years earlier, on a night when Polly sat on the floor of an empty apartment in a different city, surrounded by boxes, doing math on his phone because he couldn't afford a calculator app and didn't trust himself to do it in his head. He was 26. He had $1,140 in checking, a job that paid $52,000 a year, and a growing suspicion that the plan everyone told him to follow. Work hard, save what's left, hope it adds up. Simply wasn't built for people who started where he started. He thought about his parents that night, too, though he never said this part out loud to anyone. Neither of them had ever owned property. They'd rented the same house for 19 years, watching the landlord raise the price a little more each spring, always one bad month away from real trouble. Polly had grown up, assuming that was simply how life worked for people like them. Rent, hope, repeat. It took him until he was almost 30 to seriously question whether that assumption was actually true, or whether it was just the only version of the story anyone around him had ever lived. It started with a number Polly wrote on a sticky note and put on his bathroom mirror. $47,300. That was his rent, projected out, for the next 10 years, if nothing changed. 10 years of watching money leave his account and disappear into someone else's asset, someone else's equity, someone else's retirement. He didn't tell anyone about the sticky note. He didn't post about it. He just started making small, boring, unglamorous decisions. The kind that don't look like anything is happening until suddenly everything has changed. First, he stopped upgrading his car. He was driving a 6-year-old Honda with 91,000 miles on it, while 2 of his coworkers leased new trucks with $740 monthly payments. Nobody at work knew that difference alone was putting $8,800 a year into an index fund instead of into a bank's pocket. Second, he negotiated his salary. Twice, using nothing but research and a printed sheet of comparable offers. The first time, he sat across from his manager with his hands slightly damp, sliding a single page across the desk that showed what 3 comparable roles in the same city were actually paying. His manager looked at it for a long moment, said almost nothing, and came back 4 days later with an offer that added $6,200 a year. Polly almost didn't ask a second time. 18 months later, telling himself the first raise was already generous, that pushing again might look ungrateful. He asked anyway. That one added another $9,400. Nobody clapped for either conversation. Nobody even noticed. He just quietly kept working the same desk, the same hours, for considerably more money. Money that was now worth more than money, because of what he did with it next. Third, and this is the part most people skip, he automated everything before he could talk himself out of it. 15% of every paycheck moved into investments the same day it landed, before rent, before groceries, before he had a chance to feel the loss of it. Within 2 years, he stopped noticing it was gone. By year 3, Polly's landlord still had no idea any of this was happening. To the building, Polly was simply the tenant in 4B. Reliable, quiet, unremarkable. What the landlord didn't know, what nobody could have known just by looking at him, was that Polly's portfolio had crossed $140,000, and the building he lived in had just gone up for sale. He found out almost by accident. The listing showed up on a commercial real estate site he'd started checking out of curiosity, the way some people check sports scores. 8 units, built in 1987. Asking price, $1,150,000. Seller motivated. Retiring. Wanted a fast close. Polly read the listing 3 times before it actually landed. This was his building. The one he'd been paying rent into for 4 years. The one with the loud radiator in the hallway and the mailbox that never quite closed right. And it was for sale. For a number that, for the first time in his life, didn't feel completely impossible. He didn't have $1,150,000 sitting in cash. Nobody does. But that isn't how buildings like this actually get bought, and that's the part almost no renter ever learns, because nobody around them is having that conversation. A 25% down payment on a property like this, using a commercial loan, would be roughly $287,500. Polly had $140,000. He was short, but not as short as he expected to be, and definitely not as short as his landlord assumed anyone in that building could ever be. This is where it gets interesting. Can you guess what happens next? Polly did something almost nobody in his position does. He picked up the phone and called the listing agent, not to ask about buying, but to ask questions. How long has it been on the market? Why is the seller motivated? Is seller financing on the table? Most people never ask that last question. Most people don't even know it's a real option. It turns out it was. The seller, 71 years old, tired of managing tenants, tired of maintenance calls at midnight, didn't actually need all his money on day one. He needed enough to retire comfortably, and the rest paid over time, with interest, like a private mortgage between 2 people instead of a bank. The agent explained it plainly, almost bored, the way people explain things they assume everyone already knows. The seller would carry a second loan for $115,000 at a fixed rate, paid monthly, directly to him instead of a bank, over 10 years. That single sentence rearranged everything Polly thought he understood about buying property. He had always assumed a bank was the only door into a deal like this. It wasn't. Sometimes the door was just a tired 71-year-old man who wanted his weekends back. Polly's $140,000 wasn't just a partial down payment anymore. Combined with a smaller conventional loan of roughly $747,500 and the seller finance second position of $115,000, it was suddenly enough to actually make an offer. Not a fantasy offer, not a someday offer, an actual number he could put in writing that same week. Most people stop here. The ones who don't are the ones who actually change things. Polly stopped sleeping properly for about 2 weeks. He ran the numbers over and over on a spreadsheet that started simple and became a small, obsessive second job. 8 units. Current rents averaging $1,540 each. Gross monthly income, $12,320. Mortgage, insurance, taxes, and a maintenance reserve, roughly $8,760 a month. That left just over $3,500 a month in projected cash flow. Before he'd even factored in the part that made his hands genuinely shake the first time he calculated it. He wouldn't just stop paying rent. He would become the one collecting it. From the same building. From the same unit numbers he'd walked past for 4 years, nodding at neighbors who had no idea what he was about to do. The offer took 6 weeks to close. 6 weeks of inspections, appraisals, a lender who asked more questions than Polly thought was legally allowed, and one night where the deal nearly fell apart entirely. The inspection came back with a section on the roof, 12 years old, patched twice already, with maybe 3 good years left in it. The seller didn't want to pay for it. Polly's lender wouldn't approve without it. For 3 days, the deal sat frozen over a $4,000 disagreement that neither side wanted to move on first. Polly didn't panic. That was the part that surprised even him. 3 years earlier, a setback like that would have felt like a sign to walk away, proof that this was never meant to work out for someone like him. Instead, he picked up the phone and offered a compromise nobody had suggested yet. Split the repair cost, close 2 weeks later than planned, and both sides move on. The seller agreed within a day. He'd learned, slowly, over 3 quiet years, that money moves toward people who stay calm when everyone else assumes the deal is dead. On closing day, Paulie sat across from the same landlord's assistant who had slid him that rent increase 11 months earlier. Except this time, the papers on the table had his name on the ownership line, not the tenant line. Nobody in the room said anything dramatic. There was no music, no slow motion moment. Just 2 people signing documents in a beige office with bad lighting, one of them walking out as a tenant for the last time in his life. The next part is the one nobody talks about. Owning the building didn't feel like winning. It felt like work, real work, unglamorous work. A tenant in Unit 2 called about a leaking faucet the same week Paulie closed. Another tenant, 3 months late on rent twice already, tested exactly how patient the new owner would be. Paulie learned things about plumbing, insurance claims, and eviction law that no finance video had ever mentioned. Being the landlord wasn't the fantasy version of wealth. It was spreadsheets, phone calls, and a maintenance emergency at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday that cost him $1,860 he hadn't planned for. There was one tenant in particular, a woman in Unit 5 named Rebecca, 63, who had lived in the building longer than Paulie had been alive in the city. She was 2 months behind when he took over, and the previous owner had let it slide for so long that the number had quietly grown into something that felt impossible to fix. Paulie could have started eviction proceedings the way a textbook landlord might. Instead, he sat down with her, looked at the actual numbers together, and worked out a payment plan that got her current over 4 months instead of 0. She never missed another payment after that. Paulie never mentioned to anyone that 4 years earlier, he'd been exactly 2 rent increases away from needing that same kind of grace himself. But here's the number that changed everything. The one Paulie wrote on a new sticky note 8 months after closing. $3,940. That was his actual monthly cash flow, after every expense, after the surprises, after the tenant who eventually moved out, and the 2-week gap before a new one moved in. $3,940 a month, arriving whether he worked that day or not, whether he was sick, on vacation, or simply asleep. His old rent, the number that started all of this, was $1,890 a month. He wasn't just no longer paying it. He was collecting more than double that number every single month from the very address that used to take his money. Compare that to someone who did it differently. Same income as Paulie, same starting salary 4 years earlier. A coworker named Daniel who leased that new truck instead of driving the old Honda, who never negotiated his salary because it felt awkward, who kept his savings in a checking account, earning almost nothing while inflation quietly ate away at it. Daniel wasn't a bad person. He wasn't lazy. He simply never wrote a number on a sticky note and asked himself what 10 years of the current path actually cost. 4 years later, Daniel was still renting 2 buildings over, still watching his rent increase every spring, still assuming ownership was for people who started with more. That's the part that's hard to admit. The difference between Paulie and Daniel was never income. It was never luck. And it wasn't some secret only wealthy families get taught. It was a handful of boring decisions, repeated with enough patience that they eventually stopped being boring and started being irreversible. Daniel wasn't unaware, either. That's the detail that makes this hard to sit with. Daniel had seen the same articles, scrolled past the same advice, nodded along to the same idea that renting forever wasn't a great long-term plan. He just never wrote the number down. He never sat on a floor with an empty apartment around him and actually calculated what 10 more years of the current path would cost. The information had always been available to him. What was missing was the moment where it stopped being information and became a decision. There's a version of this story where Paulie explains all of this to Daniel over lunch one day, lays out the sticky note, the salary negotiations, the seller financing, expecting some kind of turning point. That conversation never happened, not really. Paulie mentioned it once, casually, and Daniel nodded, said that sounded smart, and went back to talking about a new truck he was considering. Paulie didn't push. He'd learned that the number on the sticky note only means something when you write it yourself, at your own kitchen table, on your own bad night. Nobody can hand someone else that moment. They have to arrive at it on their own. The next one on this list is the one nobody talks about, and it's the most powerful. It's the tenant who still lives in Polly's old unit, 4B, the one who has no idea that the landlord doing the maintenance walkthroughs used to sit in that exact same living room, worrying about the exact same rent increases. Polly never mentions it. He still drives the same Honda, now with 121,000 miles on it. He still wears the same kind of plain clothes he always wore. Nobody meeting him for the first time would guess that he owns the building 3 doors down, or that his portfolio, combined with the equity in that property, had quietly crossed $410,000. This is the part that surprised Polly the most, more than the cash flow, more than the ownership papers, more than any number on any spreadsheet. Nobody treated him differently, because nobody knew. The landlord's old assistant still waved at him in the hallway sometimes, assuming he was simply a longtime tenant of some other unit. His coworkers still talked about their new trucks and their vacation plans, having no idea that the guy eating a sandwich at his desk owned real estate outright while they were financing depreciating cars at 7% interest. Wealth, it turned out, was almost never loud. The people who actually had it were usually the ones nobody noticed at all. There's a specific moment Polly still thinks about, months later. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way, and he was walking past his old building on the way to check on a repair in Unit 6. A new tenant was moving in, carrying boxes up the same stairs Polly used to carry his own boxes up 4 years earlier. The tenant nodded at him, assuming he was maintenance, or maybe just another resident. Polly nodded back and kept walking. He didn't correct him. There was nothing to correct. He was exactly who he appeared to be, just quietly holding a lot more than anyone could see. This one is hard to admit, even now. Polly almost didn't call that listing agent. He almost let the listing sit there for 3 more days, telling himself he'd look into it later, the way most opportunities quietly die in the space between noticing them and actually picking up the phone. The only difference between the life he has now and the life he would have kept living was one uncomfortable phone call he almost talked himself out of making. Polly thinks about that floor a lot now. The empty apartment, the boxes, the phone calculator, the 26-year-old version of himself who had no idea any of this was coming. If someone had told him that night that 4 years later he'd own the building down the street from wherever he happened to be living, he wouldn't have believed it. Not because it sounded impossible, but because nothing in his life up to that point had suggested people like him got to be on that side of a lease agreement. He's careful now about how he talks about it, when he talks about it at all. He doesn't post the numbers online. He doesn't correct people who assume he's just another tenant somewhere in the neighborhood. Part of that is privacy. Part of it is something quieter. A sense that the version of wealth worth having is the kind that changes your actual life, not the kind that changes how strangers look at you. He has both now, technically, the money and the freedom, but only one of them ever mattered to him. If you're renting right now, reading rent increases the same way Polly used to, as something that simply happens to you, a weather pattern instead of a decision someone else profits from. This is the part worth sitting with. You don't need $1,150,000 in cash sitting in an account somewhere. You don't need a finance degree, or a family with money, or some rare stroke of luck that skipped over everyone else and landed on you. You need a number on a sticky note. You need to know exactly what the next 10 years cost you if absolutely nothing changes. And then you need one uncomfortable phone call you almost talk yourself out of making. The same one Polly almost didn't make, sitting on his couch, staring at a listing he'd already reloaded 4 times that morning. Somewhere right now, there's a building with a motivated seller who doesn't need all the cash on day one. There's a landlord who has no idea one of their tenants is quietly capable of becoming their buyer. There's a listing sitting on a site somewhere, refreshed by someone who keeps closing the tab and telling themselves they'll look at it seriously later, next month, once things settle down. Things rarely settle down on their own. Usually someone just decides to stop waiting for that to happen. And there's a version of you, 4 years from now, who either wrote that number down or didn't. Not a dramatic version. Not someone who won the lottery or inherited a fortune or got lucky with a stock tip at exactly the right moment. Just someone who kept driving the same car a little longer, asked for the raise they were afraid to ask for, automated 15% before they could talk themselves out of it, and eventually picked up one phone call that felt too big for them at the time. Pauly still lives 2 buildings away from where he started. He still drives the old Honda, now closer to 125,000 miles than anyone at work would guess by looking at him. He still eats the same sandwich at the same desk, still nods politely at people who have no idea what's sitting quietly in his name. Nobody watching him walk down the street would ever guess what he's quietly built, and that, more than anything else, is exactly how he wants it. And that, more than the cash flow, more than the equity, more than the sticky note that started it all, that's the actual ending. Not applause, not recognition, not some dramatic before and after moment with music behind it. Just a door that quietly opened 4 years ago because one renter decided to ask a single question nobody else in that building ever thought to ask and then kept walking through it, one boring decision at a time until the door was too far behind him to ever close again.